I go, I'm putting on. Putting on, putting on. Everywhere I go, I'm putting on. Putting on, putting on. Everywhere I go, I'm putting on. Putting on. Where you from?
Welcome to Popcorn Sports on the Popcorn Entertainment Network. I'm your host, Mickeal, and welcome to yet another episode of Why You Should Root for every team in the NBA for the 2018-2019 season. I, of course, am not alone. I am joined here by John Keeffer. He covers the Utah Jazz over for the JNotes.com. He's also the co-host of the 3 Point Threat podcast. John, how you doing tonight, man? Go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm doing fantastic, Mike. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. I'm really excited that we're able to knock this out. So my first question for you, and the question that I ask all of my guests, is how did you begin to cover the Utah Jazz?
For me, it was just right in line with my major. I'm a multimedia journalism major. I love to write, and for the longest time, I've been a diehard Jazz fan, and really not just the Jazz. I love all the NBA, but I'm from Utah, so they're the team closest to me and the team I follow the most. And it started out simple where I enjoyed writing, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to start a blog. I don't know if that's cool anymore to have a blog, but I had stuff I wanted to write. I had thoughts about the Jazz, so I started doing that, and it picked up steam, and people started reading, and I was able to get on with the day notes where I can write full time about the Utah Jazz.
That's such a cool story, especially as we've talked about a little bit off air about what I'm trying to build here. To know that you are following the same career path as me sounds pretty cool in my book. So have you always been a fan of the Jazz?
I've always been a fan of the Jazz. My family was an Air Force family, so we moved around a lot. But Utah was always where my cousins and my uncles and my aunts all were. So it always came back to Utah. And then when my dad retired from the Air Force, we moved to Utah. And at that time, I was 8 years old, and it was 1997. So the Jazz were in the NBA Finals. So I got here just in time for that big wave of, the Jazz had never been that high before, and I was hooked from a very early age.
Awesome. That's so cool. Just to have that story, and I've talked about this with other guests before. Sports are just such a unifying way, just in American culture specifically, and so to have to be able to grasp onto that, especially in a place like Utah where it is so tight knit, and that's something that we're going to talk about in a bit. That's just so cool.
Yeah, no, it's been great. And I think that's one of the best things about Utah is, really, we only have one major sports league team, and that's the Utah Jazz. So it's something that connects us all and gives us a unified thing to root for. And everybody follows the Jazz and cheers for the Jazz and hopes for the best for the team. My first year was kind of rough. I started cheering for the Jazz, and then they got their hearts ripped out by Michael Jordan. But here I am, 20 years later, still cheering for him. So.
God, I'm so sorry.
I've gotten over it.
Right.
I'm a lot of Jazz fans haven't, but...
Right, exactly. So let's...
A lot of diehard Jazz fans will still say he pushed off.
He did. He did. So let's kind of shift gears.
Definitely did.
Go. What was that?
I said he definitely did, but that's fine. Everyone gets away with that.
Right. So let's kind of shift gears now to the general overview of the Utah Jazz. So they joined the NBA in 1974 as the New Orleans Jazz. They moved to Utah in 1979. They're called the Jazz due to the music influences originally in New Orleans. Their colors are navy, green, and yellow. And you said that you checked out some of the some of the videos in this series, so you could tell that I'm doing custom layouts for each one. I'll tell you right now, the Jazz layout is one of my favorite ones that I made. It looks really nice with the navy and green blend with the yellow accents, for lack of a better term. I feel like it looks really nice. Anyway, they have 27 playoff appearances, 0 championships, and they play in the Northwest Division with Denver, Portland, Oklahoma City, and Minnesota. So now that we got all the general overview out of the way, I want to talk about last season, because the last season for the Utah Jazz was so fun. They went 48-34. They lost in the Western Conference semis after beating the Oklahoma City Thunder. The rookie standout Donovan Mickeal put the league on notice from day one, and they had a really super well-rounded team. So kind of just break down last season for me, and what were some of your thoughts?
I think it would probably just be the definition of a roller coaster. Going back not just to the start of the season, but I think when you look at last season, you have to go even further back and think of the off season where most Jazz fans, we were coming off a great series against Golden State, where even though we got swept, the team just looked like they were going to take off. We were going to re-sign Gordon Hayward to a 5-year max deal. It was going to be fantastic. And then he broke our hearts and left to Boston. And I'm over it. I'm not salty. But it was hard. It was one of those things that most Jazz fans, it was a low. It was like, oh my gosh, if we can't keep Gordon Hayward, the white kid in Utah, what free agent can we keep on the Jazz? So it was pretty disheartening, but we overcame it because we drafted Donovan Mitchell, and I think from there, the roller coaster started going up, where it was exciting. Like, oh my gosh, we saw him in Summer League, and he had one game where he scored like 36 in Summer League. He had another game where he got like 8 steals. He had one that went head to head with Jason Tatum and just really took his lunch money. It was great, and it was exciting, and the team looked like it was going to be good. And then start of the season came, and Rudy Gobert got injured, and I think most people know, I mean, first half of last year, the Jazz were not good. I believe it was January 22nd, they lost to the Atlanta Hawks, who were trying to lose, and the Jazz just got blown out. It wasn't even close. It wasn't good. And they were 9 games under 500, and it just, even the most avid Jazz fans were saying, all right, I guess we're just going to scrap it and see if we can get another really high lottery pick and start building this up again. And I mean, from there, you know what happened. I mean, they just won 11 games in a row going into All-Star break, and that got them back to 500. And then from there, they had, I believe, the second best record in the NBA over the final, 41 games or so, and by far the best defensive rating. They're really clicking on offense, and it was a really fun season. A lot of emotion, a lot of up and down, but really fun, entertaining season that kept you on your toes.
Absolutely. And was there any moment in particular that stood out to you as far as the positives, like the success? Was there maybe a moment that Donovan Mitchell had or that the team had overall that just really impressed you?
Yeah, I would say, really, I mentioned that game in Atlanta where it just really seemed like the Jazz hit a low point, and I think most of the fans thought that the season was just done, but if you look back at it, there's a tweet that, for Jazz fans, has become kind of famous. Rudy Gobert sent out a tweet after that game, and all it said was, "We will be fine." And from then on out, they just dominated. And the next game, they played Detroit, and I think this was probably the turning point, but Ricky Rubio, up to that point, had not played very well throughout the whole year. A lot of people wanted the Jazz to trade him at the trade deadline. And we played Detroit. It was a really back and forth, low-scoring game. And Ricky Rubio ended up getting elbowed right above the eye. And he had to leave in the fourth quarter to get, I think, 8 stitches. And then he came back, and he really willed the Utah Jazz to an overtime win against Detroit. And if you ask me, I think that was the turning point of the season, where they just showed really what the Utah Jazz are famous for right now. Just their grittiness and their toughness, and the fact that they'll do anything to get a victory. So for the team, I'd say it was that. Donovan Mitchell in particular, though, I mean, his coming out was definitely earlier in the season. There was a game, I think December 1st or 2nd, where we were playing the New Orleans Pelicans, back when they had Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins both healthy. And it was a close game, and he went off for, I think, his career high. I think it was 41 or 42 points. And, I mean, the Jazz would have lost that game if not for Donovan Mitchell. And at that point, he was a rookie. It was like his 15th game in the year. And I think that was the moment all the Jazz fans in particular, and really the nation, were just like, we might have something here. We might have something special in Donovan Mitchell.
And that's got to be such a great feeling. And that Rudy Gobert tweet reminds me of when Aaron Rodgers a few years ago, I think the Packers started off 0-4, and he tweeted relax in all caps, and I think they went on to win 6 straight or something absurd like that. So that's very, very similar there. I want to shift gears now and talk about this year's roster and this year's expectations for the Utah Jazz. So going through their roster, you got Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Joe Ingles, Ricky Rubio, Derek Favors, Jay Crowder, the rookie Grayson Allen out of Duke, Alec Burks, Dante Exum. Kind of break down this year's roster for me.
I think they're a very well-rounded roster. I think if you look at the Jazz, they're probably one of the deepest teams in the league. Most teams, if you lose your top guys, you lose Rudy Gobert, you lose Donovan Mitchell, like you're going to struggle. I mean, any team is going to struggle. If LeBron James gets hurt, Kevin Durant gets hurt, their teams are going to struggle. But it's interesting to look at the Jazz from 11 to 12, where, yeah, you have these two top stars, potential all-stars, but if the Jazz lose Ricky Rubio, it would suck. It would be hard because I think he's a really good point guard, but we have Dante Exum as the backup. I mean, if the Jazz lose Joe Ingles, it would be really hard. It would be rough, but we have Royce O'Neal, we have Pablo Cephalosha, we have Jay Crowder. Like, we have just such a deep roster that we can handle if there's injuries. We can handle if a few players are playing poorly. It's got to be one of the deepest teams in the league. As far as roster goes, I think we probably have one of the best starting fives. I love the starting five of Rudy Gobert, Derek Favors, Joe Ingles, Donovan Mitchell, Ricky Rubio. I think that's probably one of the top starting fives in the entire NBA. It's just very well-rounded. They know how to play together. And defensively, they know each other so well. And they put the clamps on teams. They're a fun team to watch because as far as team goes, I think they're one of the best. I'm trying to think how to say this. I think a lot of teams are just individuals playing, and I think the Jazz are individuals playing for a team. They're not playing for themselves. I think they really do have a mindset of putting the team first. And I mean, really, right now, the Utah Jazz slogan for this year is "Team is everything." And I think that's a culture that the players have really embodied, and they show it on the court.
Yeah, I think the thing with the Jazz, and I have it in my notes too, like how well-rounded they are exactly, and they just gel, and like everybody's play style just kind of fits. You know, yes, you're gonna have Donovan Mitchell's your scorer, Ricky Rubio's your facilitator, Joe Ingles is your spot-up three-point shooter, Gobert is your inside presence. Like, they just kind of have everybody, and they have two versions of that too, with their bench depth as well.
Yeah, no, they're fantastic, and I think that's the nice thing is they have players who, if one goes down, the other can stand up and take over the role. I mean, if heaven forbid Rudy Gobert goes down with an injury again, it's probably a guy that most people have never even heard of or thought of. But we have Ekpe Udoh. I mean, who's thought of Ekpe Udoh in 5 years? But last year, that's what happened. Gobert went down, and Udoh stood up and took in that position and played a good amount of minutes, and he held down the floor pretty well. I mean, the Jazz weren't as good as they were with Rudy Gobert, but they were still a pretty darn good defensive team. And I just think, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I think they're a very well-rounded team, and I don't even know how to say it. I just think their balance is incredible. They're extremely deep, and they're a great team.
Sometimes you just have to keep things simple to elaborate on it, and I feel like that's all you have to do. You know, don't make this complicated. Just call it how you see it. Now, is there a player that you're really excited to watch in this season that isn't Donovan Mitchell or Rudy Gobert?
Yeah, I mean, those are the two obvious ones, right? I would say probably Dante Exum is the player I'm most excited to watch. I think he was drafted, and he's outside of Derek Favors, and Derek Favors was actually drafted by the Nets, so he doesn't even count. Dante Exum is the highest drafted Utah Jazz player that the Jazz actually drafted. He was picked the 5th pick overall, I think, in 2014. And so far, his career's just been riddled by injuries. That's kind of been the theme.
Right.
But then the Utah Jazz, over the offseason, I think a lot of people were shocked that they signed him, not just small deal, but they signed him for 3 years, $33 million, so $11 million a year. And most people looked at that and said, "Oh, well, that's an overpay." But I think they were banking on the potential of Exum and saying, "You know what? We haven't really seen what Dante Exum can do because he's been hurt." And if he ends up reaching that potential, then that's like a steal for the Utah Jazz to get him at $11 million a year. And so far, start of the year, he's been actually really, really good. I mean, I would say over the first four games, I mean, we're overreacting to everything at this point, but he's played better than Ricky Rubio over the first 4 games. So it's been really exciting to see, because I think if he can turn the corner and become a really valuable player for the Utah Jazz and can stay healthy and broaden his game, he'll make a big difference.
Yeah, I like when Exum was coming out and when he entered the NBA draft. I mean, he was considered like one of the best prospects. I mean, there's a reason why he went in the top 5. And I was just such a big fan of his because I thought that the transition in the NBA, and you're seeing it now still, is where you're having just length. Like length matters, where you're able to have guys guard numerous positions and do multiple things on the floor. And I feel like Exum was one of the very first prospects that fit that style that the league was transitioning into. And it is just so unfortunate that he hasn't been able to stay healthy.
Yeah, and I think there's definite areas that he's going to have to grow. He's going to have to show that he can confidently shoot the ball.
Right.
I think that's his biggest area of improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Defensively, he's been fantastic. I mean, if
Yeah.
you watched the playoffs last year and saw the Utah Jazz against Houston, I mean, anytime he was matched up against James Harden, and I mean, Harden, potentially the best offensive player in the entire NBA, he was the MVP last year, he couldn't get by Exum. Like, Exum just made it so difficult for him, and that's what makes Jazz fans so excited. But there was also moments where he'd have just wide open threes that he was passed up because he didn't have the confidence to shoot the ball. And I think that's the big thing we need to see from him is just, I don't care if you only shoot 33% or 32% or whatever it is. Like, you need to confidently shoot threes because you're just going to be a logjam in the offense if they pass the ball and you won't shoot. So you need to see that out of him this year. But I'm excited for him. He's going to be a very, very interesting and intriguing player to watch this year.
Yeah, I hope he really pans out considering the fact that he also got that deal that you mentioned earlier. Now, I want to talk about the fan base, the fun, the culture surrounding the Utah Jazz. You've said you've been a fan for quite some time, the majority of your life. They're a small market with great fans. I think that's the biggest thing. And you saw that when Gordon Hayward left. I feel like everybody's kind of known that Jazz fans were like pretty intense. But then once Hayward left, I feel like that's when you really saw everyone, I don't want to say step up, but like that's when you heard it the most. So kind of like, yeah, Jazz fans.
Yeah, we might be crazy. I'm pretty sure most Jazz fans are just a hint of craziness to it.
Right.
Because we're passionate. I mean, it's like I was saying earlier. This is our only major sports team.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few minor league teams. We're really passionate about our college teams. We love BYU, the U. We got Utah State. I go to Weber State. I'm a senior there.
Shout out to Dame.
But it's our only professional. Shout out to Dame. Hopefully he'll come to the Jazz sometime. But I mean, it's the one team that we can all universally cheer for. So we're very passionate fans, and I would like to say that we're knowledgeable fans. I think for the most part, I follow a ton of people on Twitter that are Jazz fans just because that's who I'm around. And I think for the most part, they're pretty reasonable and they know what they're talking about. And that's why, I mean, you look a few years ago, the Jazz lost Darren Williams. They lost. We had a weird team for a couple of years where we had Darren Williams, Al Jefferson, Paul Millsap. It was just like we were in flux where it's like we were a step away from rebuilding, but we were holding on for just a little bit because we thought, well, we'll still make the playoffs. So once this team chose to rebuild, I mean, there were no fans really complaining about the losses because we understood the process. And I think that's something that the tip of the hat to Jazz fans is we understood and knew, like, okay, like, we enjoyed 25 years of success through the Stockton Malone and then Darren Williams eras. This is 3-4 years and then we'll be back on track, and that's what happened. So they're smart fan base with just a hint of craziness in them.
Right, and I was kind of breaking this down in my head in terms of the tiers of the Western Conference, and I'm trying to figure out where I want to put the Jazz. I have them in between that 2 and 3 tier range. I feel like Golden State is obviously number 1, but then when you get into Houston, like that's when you're like, all right, is Houston number 1 or are they number 2? And then based off that, I feel like that's where things get interesting. Because if you put Houston in that same conversation as Golden State, I think you can make the argument that the Jazz are in that number 2 tier. But I feel like they are a step below the Rockets. And so if you put Houston in that number 2 tier, then Utah falls into number 3. So I feel like they're definitely in that border. And as we talked about before, that potential there, like just within the overall, the current roster, I feel like Utah Jazz fans just have a lot to be excited about over the next handful of seasons.
Yeah, they definitely do. And I think that's a good argument that can be made right now is that the Jazz are they the second best team in the West? Are they past Houston? Because, I mean, Houston has, I know, again, it's only been 4 games, but Houston has not looked very good to start this year. And maybe the losses of Trevor Ariza, Luke Mbamute are really going to hurt them more than they expected. That's to say, I mean, when you have a healthy James Harden, Chris Paul, and Clint Capella, I think they're going to be a very, very good team in the West. But I think the Jazz could definitely push them for that 2 seed. And I think the surprise team is probably the New Orleans Pelicans. I'm really, really intrigued by the Pelicans, and the Jazz will actually be playing them tomorrow. And I'm going to be fascinated by that game because I think those 2 teams could really push the Rockets for that number 2 seed.
I was just about to ask you, what do you think the expectations for the Jazz are this year? So you guys said number 2 seed. What has to go right for that to happen?
I'd say it's a combination of 2 things. The first is just health. That's really been the Achilles heel for the Utah Jazz over the last couple of seasons, where every time it looks like they're going to go on a run, someone seems to get injured. A couple of years ago, it was George Hill could never stay healthy, and Derek Favors was having issues with his back. And then the next year, last year, it was Rudy Gobert, obviously missing, I believe it was 26 games early on in the year. So if the Jazz can stay healthy, I think their depth is going to carry them to a lot of wins. The second thing is just their offense. I mean, the Jazz have shown that they can have an average offense, and if you have really, number 1, number 2 best defense in the entire NBA, I think an average offense will carry you to 50-plus wins. But there have been stretches, and we saw the other day they played Memphis, and, I mean, there was a stretch in the third quarter where I think for 6 minutes they didn't allow Memphis to score a point, but they themselves only scored 2 points. And those are like the tough stretches as a fan where it's like, oh my gosh, like I've seen the Jazz against Golden State earlier in the year. They went off for 81 points in the first half. Like, we've seen the Jazz just click on offense. It's amazing. But then there's also been these quarters where it's like, oh my gosh, like, this is a different team and they can't hit a shot. So I think those are the 2 things, just health, and then if they can have a consistently productive offense will be the big things that can to a number 2 seed in the West.
Excellently well said, and we can wrap it up with this. You have 30 seconds to pitch anybody why they should be a fan of the Utah Jazz this season. The floor is yours.
I think if you are ready to get away from the Houston Rockets of the world with James Harden playing isolation, with Chris Paul whining to the referees, if you want to watch a team who actually is a team, who they have Quinn Snyder at the helm, who preaches a ball movement offense, he's a big, he preaches to his players and to the media that if you touch the ball on offense, even if you're not shooting, you're going to be more engaged on defense. So he has a very ball movement heavy offense, and they're just good people. If you follow Donovan Mitchell, Joe Ingles, Ricky Rubio, Rudy Gobert, follow them on Twitter and Instagram. They're the funniest people I've ever followed on Instagram, and they interact very well with one another. They're a team. They care about each other. They care about the community, and they play basketball the right way. So that's why I think it's easy to cheer for the Utah Jazz.
I was about to add before I asked you that. I was going to ask you your thoughts on Quinn Snyder, but you literally just said it in that, so I feel like I don't even have to go there. So thank you for that.
No problem.
All right. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, that was John Keeffer. You can follow on Twitter at John_Keeffer. That is Keeffer. He covers the Utah Jazz for the JNotes.com. He's also the co-host of the 3-Point Threat podcast. John, you got anything else to plug?
No, I think that's it. I'm excited for NBA basketball to be back. It seems like this summer just flew by, and I'm ready to cheer on my team.
We are all excited for that. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. We're doing this for every team in the NBA, and odds are we've already covered your favorite team, so be sure to stick around and look for that. And with that, we'll see you next time.